Lexington and Concord. So, we're going to go back to England for a second here. The thing is, in England, they're going to have parliamentary elections in the fall of 1774. Unfortunately for the Americans, the outcome of this election doesn't actually change the Great Britain's policy in regards to America. Lord North, the Prime Minister of England, his supporters win easily, and they basically resolved that Massachusetts actually is in full rebellion. So they're going to be even more strict with Massachusetts at this point. They would go on to prohibit the New England colonies from trading outside of the empire or even sending their ships to the North Atlantic fishing grounds. So very much being a lot more stringent, more than anything before. We see similar restrictions are going to follow on most of the other colonies in about February of 1775. Now, that being said, Parliament is going to follow this up by endorsing Lord North's conciliatory proposition for the American colonies. This gesture of appeasement was basically that Great Britain would pledge not to tax the colonies if the American colonies would voluntarily contribute to the defense of the British Empire. But there's a couple problems with this. The thing is, British officials just couldn't decide what was a sufficient contribution for the American colonies to make. And the thing is, even if they had figured out like a maximum colonial contribution, it's questionable if the Americans would have accepted this. Now, perhaps if they had made this deal like 10 years earlier at the closing of the, like the French and Indian War, maybe the American colonies would have found this acceptable, but we'll never know, really. This is all, what if? At this point in time, though, what we can say for sure is it was too little too late. On top of that, Lord North's government is also going to send orders to General Thomas Gage, who actually in 1774 had replaced Hutchinson as the governor of Massachusetts and then gone on to dissolve the Massachusetts legislature. Also, General Thomas Gage was the commander-in-chief of the British Army in America at this time. But basically, General Thomas Gage has been sent orders that he needs to take decisive action against these Massachusetts rebels. But this order is really going to trigger one of the first clashes between British and American forces. So I ask you, this is part of your journal. There's actually two questions, but all you're doing is numbers. The first question, at this point in time, was war likely at this point in American history? Keep in mind, war, I mean like full-on, multiple, large-scale battles, not just, like one engagement. So how likely was war? 1 being very unlikely, 10 being very likely. And then I also want to ask you, what about independence? So how likely is independence at this point, do you think? 1 being very unlikely and 10 being extremely likely. So go ahead, pause the video, kind of write down your numbers for later for your journal. On to the actual battles of Lexington and Concord, though. April 18th, 1775. General Gage is going to assemble his men on the Boston Common and then march them towards the little towns of Lexington and Concord, which you can actually see in this map here. His mission is twofold. The first part was to arrest rebel leaders such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And the second was to destroy military supplies that the Committee of Safety had assembled in Concord. Now, the reason the first part of this is so important is basically Great Britain viewed this rebellion as the work of a few individuals, and they felt like if they took out those individuals, such as like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the entire thing would fall apart. It was so much bigger than that. And this is really important because a lot of history books tend to focus on individuals within the American Revolution. And what was such a big deal about the American Revolution is actually it wasn't just individuals. We see tons of people get involved in all levels of society. And in many ways, this is a very democratic revolution, just because so many people across the colonial lines and across, class lines are involved in this revolution. And so what happens is patriots, of course, hear of this movement, and they are going to send out riders. Most famously is one of them is the silversmith Paul Revere. The reason you might recognize his name is because of Longfellow's poem that was actually not written until 1860 or 1861, that listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. What's really fascinating about this is if you listen to that whole poem, it kind of gives all of the credit to Paul Revere that, oh yeah, he comes up with this idea of, two if by land and one if by sea and everything, lighting the lanterns that warns him, and then he goes out and he warns the whole countryside. And it seems like it's the masterwork of one person. Once again, problematic because there was a lot more people involved in this. In fact, there was multiple riders that rode out, and Paul Revere actually was captured on his ride by a couple of British soldiers, and they actually held him captive all night long, threatening to kill him and that they could, turn him in and everything like that. And then in the morning, they just let him go. So he actually didn't hoard that many people. In fact, the person that you probably could focus on the most would be Dr. Joseph Warren, whose idea was a lot of it. Now, the reason that Paul Revere is so famous is A, because of Longfellow's poem, but also because it turns out after the Revolutionary War was over, a few years later, newspapers were trying to do articles on different people that had, contributed to the cause, and they actually interviewed Paul Revere, and Paul Revere gave them all this information about what happened that night, but he told them, please leave my name out of it. And then they didn't leave his name out of it. They named him specifically. So there you go. That's one reason that we actually remember Paul Revere to this day. Anyway, back to what actually happened, though. These British soldiers are going to reach Lexington at dawn. And when they reach there, it turns out there are 70 armed militiamen drawn up in formation on the village green. So these are American soldiers, so to speak, but American militiamen. Now, the thing is, these American militiamen were outnumbered 10-1. And really, they were most likely there as a show of defiance and just demonstrating that Americans aren't going to back down from a superior British force. Still, a British major is going to order them to disperse. And in fact, the American militiamen had started to obey this order when a shot rings out. No one knows which side fired first, but we do know that after this first shot, the British are going to respond with a volley that kills or wounds 18 Americans. From there, the British are going to push on towards Concord. They would burn what few supplies the Americans had not been able to hide. And then as they turn around, their rear guard comes under Patriot fire at Concord's North Bridge. You can even see that on this map. The British are going to panic as they retreat to Boston. Patriot, Minutemen, and other militia would just harry them from both sides of the road. So obviously they've been warned of this. They've organized everything like that. In total, the battles of Lexington and Concord, you have about 273 British soldiers are dead, wounded, and missing, and nearly 100 Americans would be dead, wounded, or missing. But what's really important about this is not just the violence, but the aftermath. The news of this fighting is going to spread extremely quickly across the colonies. And the fact that this news spreads so rapidly just shows how much importance Americans attach to it. And just the fact of the extraordinary efforts made by the Patriots. This is really going to spur the Whigs into action. We'll see that, later on, 19th century philosopher and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson talked about these shots and said that these were the shots that were fired and they could be heard round the world. And many historians really mark this as the start of the American Revolution. Of course, now the American leaders have a revolution on their hands, and they are going to have to basically assume leadership of this rebellion when they convene in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress in 1775 through 76. Basically, this Congress, in effect, is going to become the national government over these few months. They would do things like call for their local forces to be organized into an actual continental army. They authorized the formation of a navy, established the post office, authorized the printing of paper continental dollars so that, they could meet the expenses of all this. They, of course, denied Parliament's claim to govern the colonies. They were not willing to declare independence. So they're still not declaring independence. Keep that in mind. In fact, they really wanted to preserve their ties to Great Britain by expressing loyalty to the crown. So they didn't want anything to do with Parliament, but they wanted to, still be loyal to the king. And so to do this, they're actually going to put forward the Olive Branch Petition. This was a petition that specifically addressed King George III. It was written on July 5th of 1775. So kind of keep in mind, hopefully you already know what's going to happen on July 4th of 1776, the next year. So still 1775. They basically asked the king in this petition to protect his American subjects from military actions taken by Parliament. The following day, then, Congress would go on to approve the Declaration of Causes and necessity of taking up arms. This is basically asserting that American patriots would rather die as freedmen than to live as lives as slaves. I mean, a little dramatic considering that's not exactly the same thing as slavery, but there you go. You get the idea. The last point, though, about this all is we have to look at putting forward a commander-in-chief over these continental forces. And John Adams, a Whig leader from Massachusetts, is going to nominate George Washington, a Virginian, for this job. The reason this is so important is because, first of all, if you think about every single conflict that has been covered so far in all of these PowerPoints, basically every single one has occurred in Massachusetts or generally like in the New England region. And so if they have a Virginian over the Continental Army, so to speak, then A, his leadership could attract recruits from Virginia, but also this really transforms this from a local quarrel in New England to a continental conflict. Washington would be the one who's going to take command over these Patriot forces around Boston. Now, I know I just talked about that, like, we can't focus too much on individuals. However, I'm not going to lie, Washington is extremely important, and he is really ideal for this job. Yes, there's problems with Washington. We're going to get more into those a bit later, but in this time, it's extremely important that he has this position, this leadership position. The thing is, there were some individuals that might have had like quicker minds or broader educations. Washington, in fact, was really embarrassed by the fact that like he didn't know like Latin as fluently as many of his other contemporaries and everything. But what's really important about Washington is he has excellent judgment, and he really had a profound understanding of both the uses but also the limitations of power. He understood what kind of structure needs to be in place, really. But also he has a huge just gift of command. His troops are going to revere him. It's one of those, think back to like probably in high school at some point, you had one of those teachers, hopefully you did, that was just amazing, that you really hung on their words, that you learned so much from them, and that was probably just one really enjoyable class. That was Washington on some level. His troops revered him. You have individuals that would write about, oh, I was only going to work for a couple months under Washington, but now I cannot come home because I've been inspired to really put everything forward to help the rebellion. Like, it's very much, Washington was a hugely inspirational character. I shouldn't say character, I should say actual person and everything. And he also realizes the fate of the Patriot cause depended on the survival of the army. everything comes down to actual fighting on the field on some level. And Washington, there's going to be a few times that Washington actually wants to like attack. And this is where I talk about his gift of command and limitations of his power. He was very aware of that he should listen to those around him. And there's actually quite a few times that people around him say, Washington, no, we can't attack that yet. And he listens to them. And this is one reason that like he is just an excellent leader in this point in time in American history.